On today's episode of the Critical Mass Podcast, we are talking to Dr. Lassiter Speller and Dr. Patrick Rogers with the ADOS Research Institute. Stick around, this is a conversation that matters. Welcome to the Critical Mass Podcast, where we discuss all things ADOS and build the critical mass needed to fight for reparations and a transformative Black agenda. I am Simeon, and today we're tackling the urgent need for dedicated research on American Descendants of Slavery. So I want to dive right in and talk to our guest today. But before I do so, I just want to talk about the important need of data for our community. And as we continue the fight to do things like disaggregate data, as we continue to fight for an ethnic identity and things of that nature for American descendants of slavery, research is going to be tantamount in that. So my two guests today are Dr. Lassiter F. Speller and Dr. Patrick Rogers. Both are co-founders of the ADOS Research Institute. So I'll start with Dr. Lassiter F. Speller, who is an assistant professor of psychology and chair of the Department of Psychology and Political Science at Eastern New Mexico University, Portales. He is also the co-founder and co-director of the ADOS Research Institute. Dr. Speller received his BA in psychology from Winston-Salem State University before earning his master's and PhD in cognitive experimental psychology from The Ohio State University. His primary research focus is on cognition and psychophysiology. However, he has a range of research and publication interests, including linguistic reality monitoring in politics, human factors in ergonomics, and user interface experience, as well as design research and environmental psychology. Give a critical mass welcome to Dr. Speller. How's it going, Dr. Speller?
It's going all right. How about yourself?
It's going wonderful. I appreciate you jumping in all the way from New Mexico.
Yes, sir.
You're officially one of the only people that I know personally in New Mexico, and I'm happy to have actually met your acquaintance and being able to say Portales on the back end of New Mexico, Eastern New Mexico University. Thank you for
Yes,
joining.
sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm glad to be here.
Happy to have you. We also have Dr. Patrick Rogers. Dr. Rogers is a scientist who is interested in using his skills and talents to help people live longer, healthier lives. His desire to apply the tools of chemistry to tackle the biological and medical problems affecting society led him from Howard University, where he earned his bachelor's in chemistry at the University of California, Davis. At UC Davis, he earned a PhD in chemistry with a concentration in organic chemistry and chemical biology. Following graduate school, Dr. Rogers began his postdoctoral training at Janssen, the pharmaceutical company of Johnson & Johnson, and continued his training at the Mulder Center of Drug Discovery at Temple University. After completing his postdoctoral training, Dr. Rogers served as a lecturer in the chemistry department at Howard University. In his current role, working as a toxicologist, Dr. Rogers evaluates the human health effects of organic molecules. In addition to his work as a toxicologist, Dr. Rogers serves as the co-founder and co-director of the ADOS Research Institute. He's also a parishioner at St. Augustine Catholic Church in Washington, D.C., and a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated via the Pi Upsilon Lambda chapter. Dr. Rogers, great to have you on today. Thank you so much for joining the Critical Mass Podcast.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I've read some intros in my life, okay? These were really, really cool intros. I'm glad it was written down because some of it I don't know. A lot of it I don't know. but I can read. So, of course, I'm going to ask you all to explain a little bit about yourselves and your research and how you got there. So, I'd love to start with you, Dr. Rogers. In your bio, you talked about your desire to apply the tools of chemistry to tackle biological and medical problems affecting society. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and clue us in where you are on your journey now?
So great question. And most certainly I love talking about it and sharing my passion for science and what brought me into science. And I would say it started from a desire to help people live longer and healthier lives. That was the end goal, but I wasn't sure what was the best major to study to help me or what career path to take to help me get to that end goal. But what attracted me to chemistry was the fact that was organic chemistry, because a lot of your blockbuster drugs are organic molecules. And so I felt that organic chemistry was the starting point by which you could make the next blockbuster drug, the next anti-cancer therapeutic that could treat whatever disease you wanted, you felt was necessary to treat. And so that's what captivated me to start on this journey. And over throughout my training, I would say my desire, my focus kind of broadened, where it wasn't just about making the next therapeutic, but it was more of using the tools and insights of chemistry to really help us understand like biological processes like DNA damage, like, and which is really like how, like what chemically happens to cause a DNA base, which is a chemical structure, to be modified to create something that can lead to mutations in your DNA if it's not checked and repaired. And so what the process of repair is really just scanning the DNA, an enzyme, and is actually recognizing that change in the chemical structure such that it can facilitate the removal of that modification and protect the, we call it the genome, but protect the genome from um, allowing it to maintain fidelity, allowing it to not cause mutations.
So when you speak of like mutations, right?
Mhm.
Like, are we talking cancer? Are we talking other ailments that come along? Like, help us understand what you mean by mutation.
So when we talk about mutations, some of the downstream effects can be cancer, can be aging, can be some of those processes that happen. Because what would happen is that, like, as your DNA becomes RNA, then becomes proteins, what happens is that those mutations, those DNA mutations, can lead to maybe proteins that don't do their job as well as their natural, as the unmodified protein. And so what that was not where you didn't have the mutation. And so if you don't have the proteins that can do their job as well, then potentially this could, down the road lead to issues such as cancer and aging.
Mm. Yo, that's some real stuff, Dr. Rogers. That's some real stuff. So obviously that's where your mind was when you were in school. Like, hey, you want to make an impact into that. And I'm guessing that led you more into that research arm and looking into it.
Yes, definitely. So from undergrad through internships, most of my work, most of my research in the lab was at that time was focused on like doing research under this umbrella of using chemical tools and chemical insights to study biological processes. And for various, most of my experiences can be kind of couched under that umbrella term. And so I would say, like, where I am along that journey now, as I'm still there, I think that vision that I had for myself has taken me in many directions that I could not have foreseen when I was in undergrad, but it has been a wonderful journey, and I'm excited to see where it takes me in the future. And I also would say that I don't think that that journey would have, without that journey and broadening my focus, I wouldn't be here today talking to you.
Well, I'm so glad you're here today talking to me. And I'm glad that you're doing some research around our community. Dr. Speller, your primary research is on cognition and psychophysiology. Okay, I wrote psychophysiology with dashes, okay, just to make sure I could get the whole thing out. Okay, you're gonna have to break that down for us and tell us what that is.
Sure, sure. First, I'll say I'm glad to be here as well. Thank you for the invitation. Um, so, psychology is a very broad field. There are going to be psychologists pretty much everywhere you turn. And one of the things that I tell my students is that psychology is more than couches and clipboards. And so, the origins of psychology come out of philosophy and physiology. And so, specifically, cognition is the study of how we think and related to things like intelligence, how we sense and perceive, how we make judgments and decisions. And I take that and I combine it with some physiological elements and how it is that we may come out with some sort of behavioral patterns that we can recognize. What we try to do in psychology is describe, explain, predict, and change human behavior. And so, through things like psychophysiology, we can take, for instance, one of the main areas that I've done research in has to deal with the cardiovasculature. So, we can take heart rate and heart rate variability, for instance, and make some pretty good predictions as it relates to comorbidities, indices of health, how people will perform, um, from a cognitive standpoint, thinking and doing things, how people will perform from a physical standpoint in some instances, like how well they'll do at a specific task that they're asked to do. Just for a couple of examples, my master's thesis was on the golf swing and heart rate variability, or heart rate, and we wanted to see if there's any kind of connection. We were looking at it as a cognitive problem because there is a lot of timing involved. One of the things about a golf swing, I don't know if anybody here golfs. I've studied it quite a lot. Not that great at it, but I've studied it quite a bit. One of the things that's really going to be key for getting better at golf is going to be consistency. And so the timing that has to happen. There's the backswing, downswing, follow through. There's the back foot, front foot weight shift. That right there is a 3 versus 2 polyrhythm. That polyrhythmic structure is something that we have to have in terms of timing. How does our psychophysiology impact that? How are people able to regulate their emotions, regulate whatever systems? We're all here doing the recording. I'm sure there's some manner of nerves, although you're a pro at this, so maybe not you. But as we prepare to, have some proper production here, we're regulating our minds, we're regulating our emotions, we're trying to, remain calm, cool, and collected so that we come across as, as either approachable or knowledgeable, right? As I'm rattling off a bunch of stuff here, or whatever it is, right? So there's a lot there in terms of cognition, how we think, how we process, and then the physiology bit is something that I've tried to apply in a variety of different contexts.
As I listen to both of you all talk, one thing that's clear is that we have the right guys. I found what both of you all are, your specialties really, really fascinating. And I'd argue that the majority of ADOS people aren't going to meet or don't regularly meet folks who are that entrenched in academia or that entrenched in science to be able to have some of the conversations that I know we need to have as a community. You two together created something that I think is really, really cool, which is one of the reasons why I was like, hey, I'd love to have the gentleman on to talk about it, which is the ADOS Research Institute. And according to your page, according to your website, which is ADOS, ADOSRI.org, It states the American Descendants of Slavery Research Institute was born from a movement dedicated to better understanding and subsequently improving the material condition of the American descendants of slavery and their lived experiences. Although research pertinent and applicable to Black people exists, it became abundantly clear to us that the way forward for Black people in the United States included the evaluation and application of data-driven solutions and remedies to address the persistent challenges of ADOS people. Thus, the ADOS Research Institute was formed with the specific purpose of centering ADOS as the primary population of study. And you have a few more words on there about the researchers and collaborators, but I kind of want to stick with that first paragraph in your About Us section, specifically the centering ADOS as the primary population of study. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the ADOS Research Institute and how this thing came about between the two of you? And I'll take that from either Dr. Speller or Dr. Rogers, whichever one of you winks first at the camera.
He's pausing, so I'll go ahead and jump in.
I'll go with Dr. Speller.
I'll tell my perspective and he can share his. One of the things that I've really been interested in is how, it started as a dream that I had of one day being involved in a research institute where I was, involved in some capacity and doing something that made a change. Now, I did end up becoming a professor, which I think there are a variety of ways that I can make a change and influence folks as they're entering their different courses of study. But there was something special about the idea of an institute that's focused on something specific. At the time, I didn't know what I wanted it to be. And then over the years, I kind of began to do some side research because I'm in behavioral science or psychology. I'm not in like a social science of like history or sociology or any of the other stuff. But one of the things that I always say is my existence as an ADOS person is inherently political, whether or not I want it to be. And so therefore I, having this high need for cognition, right? Speaking of it, felt the need to be well-versed in it because wherever I ended up, I figured somebody was going to ask me a question, especially as I kind of climbed through graduate school, higher ed, now academia, and I'm very much often the only one in there. And so when I linked up with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation and was involved in some of the work that was going on there in the Management Information Systems team, I felt like there was more that I could contribute. And I just figured that maybe we'd have a team that did some additional kinds of research. And then there were additional PhDs in there that I discovered, and the cogs started turning. And I was like, I spoke to someone, and I was saying, "Hey, what about like an institute, a research institute? We can study these things." And they said, "Oh, okay, great idea. You should figure out how to make that happen." And so we kind of put ideas to paper, or screens, I guess these days, a combination of both. And it was kind of birthed out of this. And so as the 501c3, our focus is less, not really about advocacy per se, but what it's about is pursuing specific ADOS-centered research as a specific population. There's a lot that you can. I've always disliked the racial categorization that can happen in behavioral and social sciences as people try to make statements and find facts and try to use empiricism to say certain things about people groups. And the racial categories are fraught with errors and pseudoscience and, really bad history. And so one of the things that I had always been doing leading up to this point was, making it a point to say in the research teams that I was on, let's break this up a little bit. These categories are too broad in our demographics. Can we just insert this? And so most of them would be amenable to it. They didn't really get it, but it was fine. But here with this specific institute, it will allow us to really hone in and focus on this specific population. We can have the leverage and the latitude to be able to have something to say specifically about this population. And then as we produce the data, as we publish the data in any of the myriad outlets that might be available, then people can take that information and go with it. But we want to be kind of the tip of the spear as we're talking about ADOS people because of many of the social economic issues that are health issues that are occurring around us. And as we continue to move forward and seeing how the country is shaped by various forces, we don't want to be forgotten and left out. And having that data there that can speak to the material condition of ADOS people is going to be paramount.
100%. I think about all of the issues where I read an article and it describes people of color as having this, oh, well, there's a housing issue for people of color. But when you break down that data, the housing issue is primarily for Black. And then if we broke down that data even more, I bet you we find, and we found that the housing data are that a particular subset of data is really primarily ADOS. And so I know that that's something that people see in even the diversity space, where it is these broad, huge categories of everybody, but this one little group or one segment. And so I found so much data it seems to be packaged that way. It's packaged as, hey, all of these people here that have damn sure nothing in common need to be shared in this data set versus some of the specifics that really show some of the harms that are happening in our community. So that's super awesome. I had the chance to meet both of you all in person on the first day of the National Reparations Summit. You all hosted an ADOS research symposium. Which I just thought was amazing. And one of the things I noticed was it wasn't just y'all two. There was a whole collection of PhDs and researchers who were talking about ADOS research in their respective fields. And I think it's really cool because you all's fields aren't the same at all. Right, I'd argue they're like in totally different areas. Like you spoke of a behavioral science for you, Dr. Speller, whereas chemistry with you, Dr. Rogers, and all of those advanced words that came with the chemistry. And I remember chemistry, organic compounds, and molecules. Okay, if I had to just break it down, right, all of the things that came with that. Those are totally different specialties. And would you say in both of those areas and everything in between, we need disaggregation?
I would definitely say so. To go back to get to the point where we talk about disaggregation, I would say from my perspective, it my process leading to this point was more of a stepwise versus, like, in contrast to Dr. Speller, where he had a kind of that vision and it kind of came to fruition. I think for me, that was a question that I had early on, was when I learned about the ADOS movement and I wanted to get involved. The question was, how do I do that as a chemist? With, like, I don't have a political science training. I may read political science or behavioral science articles, but I am not trained in that discipline. So how could I contribute to a movement that really resonated with me? And for me, I came to the ADOS movement during one of the shows on YouTube that Yvette Carnell did, and it resonated with me. It was the topic was when striving is bad for your health, and that show
I remember that show.
And it talked about how this software engineer from Uber, a Black man who was a software engineer, relocated from North Carolina to California to pursue this goal. And 6 months on the job, the pressures of that environment led him to, unfortunately, end his life. And that resonated, like, the fact that not only were we talking about, like, data, but we talked about, like, this was someone also in a STEM field who was highly successful and wanting to go to what he felt was one of the top tier companies in his discipline, and that led him to actually end his life. And so the combination of like a real life story with the data captivated me, and I continued to listen to Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore. And when the opportunity came to be a part of the ADOS Foundation, ADOS Advocacy Foundation, I jumped at that opportunity. I felt like, you know, it was well worth the wait. And so at that time, I was able to participate in the policy team. And that was an enjoyable experience because what captivated me was the intellectual approach to advocacy. Like, we were doing literature reviews. This was where I felt like I could bring my skill set, in a sense. Like, I'm not looking up chemistry articles, but the process of looking up peer-reviewed articles, primary source documents, compiling that information into a digestible manuscript that could be accessible for the lay person, that's in plain language, really was something that was a transferable skill. And so through my work on the policy team, I really found that I could contribute to the movement in a way that was intrinsic to the work that I had done in chemistry. And so during one of our policy team meetings, the policy team, I had not disclosed that I had a PhD, but
you were holding that close, all of those letters.
I was just, I just wanted to show through my work that, let my work show the training that I had. And so during one conversation, the policy team director asked me, oh, are you going back to get your PhD? And I said, oh, actually, I already have it. and so that led to a further conversation. And that's when the nugget was inserted into my head that maybe I should come together with Dr. Speller and some of the other scholars that we have that are volunteering their time with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation and do some research. And that stuck with me because I had enjoyed doing work on different projects, such as the Black Agenda. I thought that was that's one of my favorite work products because of just the intensive literature review that you need to do to produce a product of that quality. And so I connected with Dr. Speller, and that kind of led us to kicking around the idea about a research institute and what that could be. And so in a very stepwise iterative process, that led me to really be sold on the idea and work with Dr. Speller to bring that to fruition.
Right on. And so all three of us who are talking today really met volunteering, donating our time, our skills and abilities to advance ADOS people. And so in my understanding, I know the ADOS Advocacy Foundation has no employees. It's 100% volunteer, 100% funded by small donations from people across the country. The ADOS Research Institute, too, is all volunteer, correct?
Correct.
100%.
I find some beauty in that. I don't find beauty in just unfundedness. But I do find beauty in people coming together, specifically ADOS people coming together to say, hey, I have a profession or an ability or a talent or a skill that I want to contribute to moving the needle forward for my people in this fight for justice. So I love that you all went out and said, okay, we can build something that helps with that suits your individual talents and skills and training, not to leave off training, because that's a whole lot of training. One of these days, I'm gonna ask y'all how long y'all were in school. We're gonna save that part. I happen to know a PhD or two, and I remember one of the hardest questions to answer was, "Hey, when are you gonna be done?" So you know what I mean? That was one of the hardest. That,
Yeah.
hey, how long? Because in most fields of study, you have something where you're like, hey, yeah, this is normally going to take me 4 years and I'm going to be able to get this out, or this 2 years for this associate's, or even a master's in a lot of cases. But I know when we're talking about that PhD, sometimes it seems like the master's just comes along the way while you were
100%.
really pushing that PhD. So, um,
Yeah.
you know, both of you all have been in some form or fashion entrenched into academia, whether that be working in academia currently or whether that be in doing all of that dang schooling, right? And working in academia as a professor at some point in time. In that research world, not just in academia, but in academic research as a whole, what are some of the blind spots that you see that you believe the ADOS Research Institute is able to kind of uh, clear up or make more visible?
Mm. Go ahead,
Now,
Dr.
wait,
Ashes.
did I stump the PhDs? I know I didn't.
No, no, no.
Okay,
We
okay.
are of like mind in that we pause. You should be in on some of these calls that we make to each other in terms of how we're going about the research institute. There'll be long pregnant pauses as we're formulating how it is that we want to address the question at hand.
See, that's what
But
happens when you're
please,
in a room of thinkers,
yeah,
right? So
please,
it's
Dr.
like,
Rogers,
hey,
go ahead.
yeah, let's go with it.
I would say, even though within the biomedical sciences, and I think you see some. There are some articles that do talk about the breakdown, the differences, so, or as we term it, disaggregating the Black racial classification. But I don't think there is a lot. There's still room to grow in that area. Like, for example, there is one study from the New England Journal of Medicine from the late 90s that showed that low birth weight, like when they compared, I think, African American or Black American or ADOS, the birth weight of ADOS babies versus like white babies versus those of, I think, that had parents from African countries. Like, you see like this significant difference. And so these small studies here and there kind of capture and kind of show you that there's a difference between Black Americans or ADOS versus those from the Caribbean and those from African countries. But I think having robustness and many studies so that you can kind of paint a picture across different, whether it be behavioral issues, social issues, or even in the biomedical sciences and tech, like having that continuum of knowledge to kind of help people see across disciplines there is a difference between ADOS versus other Black populations is, I think, crucial in helping us kind of know what to do next. Because I think people can talk about, like, hey, all of, like, advocacy is necessary, but I think one rate limiting step that kind of may impact downstream implications of the research is really having the body of work that can show that there is a distinct difference, not fundamental in biology, but the unique experiences of ADOS has impacted ADOS people and ADOS communities at not just the environment, and it seeped into different factors that we can measure.
Mm.
I want to slingshot off that. You mentioned in the social behavioral sciences and the disaggregation as well. I liken this to another thing that I tell my students about psychology, particularly in the intro courses, where um, I try to paint the picture that we all have our own psychological experiences, which are fine, but we should understand that they are from our own perspective. They may be laden with specific biases. They come through our own perceptions. And the difference between that and psychological science is that psychological science is trying to, in a way, have an understanding of, again, describing, explaining, predicting, and changing human behavior, but a little bit more on an aggregate scale here. We're talking about what happens in these human populations when they go through conditioning, or when they go through, any of these various subdisciplines in psychology, one of which, environmental psychology, which you mentioned was a relatively recent research interest of mine, I think overlaps a bit with some of the toxicology work that Dr. Rogers deals with. In my area, one of the things that we have to deal with is hard water, especially way out here on the high plains. And not only that, but when there are contaminants from a U.S. military base that seep into those particular waters, how does that impact people's environmental quality of life? So one of the projects that we're working on right now is developing a scale for rural individuals who live in the Southwest and assessing their quality of life. What this can do, and I think this parallels with kind of with the vision of the Research Institute, what this can do is highlight issues that are present for people in their lived experiences. We can talk about how various factors will impact them, whether it's from a purely organic level and looking at the way that those molecules and whatever else is happening there interchange with one another and how that may affect the organism. And then the psychology of that organism as they're having to live and do all the other things that they're required to do, from being a higher human, right, with your levels of stress that you have to deal with, like I mentioned before about how we're regulating ourselves. And then you also have these other cognitive thoughts that are layered on top of that. How is that an impact, and how does that affect? Well, by disaggregating the data, especially from this kind of behavioral social sciences perspective, we're able to see how different populations may be impacted by the different effects of the things that could be in their environment, that could be from whatever lived experiences that they've had, whether it's a policy thing that may exist, so on and so forth. So the Institute's goal is to produce these data, interpret these data, empirically, without bias, and then we can take those findings and disseminate them, which is what researchers and scientists do. And then people who are interested in advocacy work can take those and then shape and change the policies, hopefully for the betterment of humans, because that's kind of what I would hope, at least, is an underlying through line here, is that we're all trying to make it better for each other. I know that there's some things out there that may suggest otherwise, but at least that's part of what I feel that I'm here to do, is to help better the lives of all people, and specifically with a focus on this ADOS population.
And I would say to that point, when we from a like biological, chemical, from physical and life science perspective, when you're looking at, for example, like we know, for example, that like cultural epigenetics, which is basically like your trauma can pass down from generation to generation. So like what from like ADOS history in the United States, you can see like this specific population has, from slavery through Jim Crow, like we talk about it as from a historical perspective, but how does that impact someone biologically? Like, and there are certain ways in which they've measured, I think, like the length of, like, for example, showing that where, like, when they compared like Black women to, I think, white women, there was a study that showed that Black women of a certain demographic, like, while your biological age and the chronological age may be different, and so like, and that can be maybe as a result of, and if we were able to look at it deeper and look at like, okay, are these all ADOS, or is this population sample all ADOS? And starting to make those connections to see how these historical events have impacted not only how this population lives, how we live as ADOS people, but even like how does that set us up biologically for different ailments. For example, I just saw this documentary on PBS, My Mama Joe, and it talks about how this Black family, I believe they may be ADOS family, I'm not sure, but how they dealt with Alzheimer's disease. And one demographic was that one statistic that was mentioned is that I think Black Americans are like 2 times as likely to or twice as likely to have this issue pop up. And so the question becomes like, if you have these health disparities that you see, my question is, what is it like on a fundamental level biologically that's leading to you having these biological effects leading to Alzheimer's disease, which is what I learned is like a family of diseases, and you can have dementia and other types of diseases associated with Alzheimer's. But how do we understand the historical, the lynching, the racialized terror, and how that impacts us as ADOS people at a fundamental level, and how do we carry that from generation to generation that lead us to be predisposed to certain diseases, certain adverse health outcomes?
I love that you brought that up, or kind of brought that home for us, because I know one of the most fascinating things I was hearing at the ADOS Research Symposium in last October was about like blood pressure. I know one of the presenters talked about blood pressure and how the effects of racism and other factors make it even harder to relax. And at night, not having your blood pressure go down, the impact that has on your vascular system, things that I had never considered or even heard talked about from an ADOS lens. So when I think of the Research Institute, the ADOS Research Institute, I think about being able to get information from an ADOS lens, talking about ADOS and how different things impact us. I know.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No,
I was
please.
just going to interject real quick and say that was Dr. LeBaron Hill, who I went to graduate school, and we come from that same family, researching cardiovasculature and HRV, and looking at, he's clinical psych, I'm cognitive psych. But one of those, to drive the point home even further, we're labeling this thing that happens, this research group that we're in, we're labeling this the cardiovascular conundrum, because in talking about what looks to be an ADOS kind of effect of this, is that there's something called autonomic balance, which is basically how your body tries to reach homeostasis. It tries to manage its allostatic load. Basically, you try to reach a point where you're stable effectively. Stress can elevate that, and then over time, you can kind of burn yourself out. But in trying to reach that point, what you're talking about, at the end of the day, when you kick your shoes off, eat your popcorn, we were talking about before, right? And you're trying to relax. But what we're finding is there seems to be some autonomic balance that's there relative to other groups. But then at the same time, we're still seeing higher blood pressure, which is an indicator of poorer autonomic functioning. So what about this particular group here that is giving these findings? Number one, can we replicate them, right? We need to see if we can replicate these findings and corroborate what was found previously. But number two, because it's more focused on this particular group of people, because we are developing this body of literature that maybe kind of encapsulates what it means to be of this particular group, instead of just this, what do you call it? This homogenous other, if you will, right? And trying to figure out who these people are specifically, then you can maybe have some specific recommendations, policy or health or psychological or whatever it is to help remedy whatever issues it is that they're dealing with. So it's all in and throughout this.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think back for me, the first book that I read that really touched on like disaggregated data. And I'm not saying this is the first one that was made, but it was the first one that I read was Todd G. Hamilton's Immigration and the Remaking of Black America. And how he talked about basically the different experiences within America from a newly immigrated Black person and ADOS. And while he didn't use the term ADOS, like he was talking about Native Black Americans or those who descend from slavery. Are there other, and this talked about labor, that talked about labor and Dr. Lassiter, Dr. Speller, the thing you just talked about was cardiovascular health, right? So just from an imagination perspective, so we have labor, health, cardiovascular health, or subsections, or even larger groups of that. What other areas will disaggregated data make a difference?
I think to your point of like the different experiences that Dr. Hamilton kind of shined a light, illuminated through that book, Immigration and the Remaking of Black America. I think understanding that, like, having a fundamental understanding of what it means for ADOS people or Black Americans who descend from slavery, what that means. Like, you understand what that means in a historical sense, but what does that mean in a deeper sense across the different disciplines? For example, Dr. Speller talked about like the blood pressure at the end of the day is still high. Well, one question that leads me to ask about, like, that touches on a similar study by Dr. Shervin Asari, Dr. Tommy Curry, who showed that there's a positive correlation as Black men increase professionally. There's a positive correlation with the likelihood of major depressive disorder. And so you're talking about Black men, and there could be, for disaggregation, there could be a question of, are these ADOS men versus, and how does that ADOS lineage render itself how does coming from an ADOS background like increase the likelihood of major depressive disorder? And also, because if you have these highly successful Black men, the question with high income may not have high wealth, but having high income, the question becomes, theoretically, these men have more options food-wise. You have options of like exercise. So what is going on in a deeper level that is like, how is that stress? How do you measure that stress? What are the implications like across different types of studies? There are a multitude of studies you could do just on that one topic to really and attack it from different disciplines to help understand, like, do you have food insecurity? Do you have issues around, like, because of the stress, you're going to stress eat even when you should be relaxing? And how does all of that factor in to the health profile of Black men and then disaggregated to ADOS men?
Are you telling me to put the potato chips down, dude? Is that what you're saying? Put the potato chips down, dude?
I'm saying that we have to really We
Just
have
get the
to
baked
ask
ones. Just
ourselves,
get the baked
like,
ones.
why?
Why?
Why
Yeah.
do we, what about this experience that we have leads us to potentially eat the potato chips versus maybe a salad? Or
Yeah.
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 I will just say it's much harder to get a salad at 11 p.m. Okay. All right.
Yeah, that's a really
I say that
interesting.
in jest.
It's a really interesting line of inquiry because this is kind of in the realm of my wheelhouse with our behavioral choices and things, and that's actually what came to mind. So that was a great segue, Dr. Rogers. What came to mind when you asked the question, Simeon, was judgment and decision making. I think about it from a cognitive perspective, how we think, how we evaluate information, and then how that will spin off into other things like behavioral economics, which is a relatively new field-ish, I guess you can say. Nothing really is new under the sun, but in terms of a specific discipline that grew legs is relatively recent. I think it's like maybe the 70s or 80s or somewhere in there, but we're kind of more so incorporating the idea of the human. They call it Homo psychologicus as opposed to Homo economicus. So the idea is you have econs versus humans, and the econs are going to make these rational choices and decisions. They're going to evaluate all the options. They might even maximize. But what we find for humans is that they are irrational at times. You can decide, you know what? I know that this option is better, but because I'm going to feel better, or because the other people around me are engaging in this, or because I just don't care right now, I want to make this particular choice, even though I may know that there are other options out there, and you'll see more of a satisficing happening than you will a maximization of choices. And so I'm, kind of, as I increase my areas of interest, in particular, as you mentioned earlier about the unfundedness that can come with a startup situation. What are some of the areas that at least I can start to gather some information, do a little bit of lit review in areas that are related to mine, so that then we can maybe have some spring off points as we decide and prioritize where we want to move forward with any of those future projects. But yeah, that's where my mind went to immediately is how we make choices, how we make decisions on certain things.
So we need ADOS research. Like we need ADOS research, right? Can we settle that? Yeah, we need ADOS research. For any who may have just tuned in or you want to know more about the ADOS Research Institute, make sure you go to adosri.org and you can find out more about the ADOS Research Institute. So if you had a magic wand, if you just had a magic wand, I see you right there, Dr. Speller. If you had a magic wand, what area would you shore up or dive into tomorrow? You had a magic wand, funding wasn't an issue, wasn't a question. Because I know one of the ways that Black organizations get controlled a lot of times is funding. So I love that we're a grassroots group of organizations, that the Research Institute is grassroots, but there is a day where funding may be really important for the types of research that you all want to do. So what type of magic wand, or what would you do with your magic wand if funding wasn't an issue or anything of that nature right now?
I think I would look to do a comprehensive study that looked at like that kind of bridges disciplines. So if there's a way that, and I think Dr. Speller may know where I'm going with this, but if you have some way where like we know like the trauma in people's like cultural epigenetics and the trauma that we carry. For example, looking at the descendants of Tulsa, if like from those survivor and their families, if there's a way, for example, there's a lot to happen before that, but just as an example, if we were if there was a way that we could like profile these ADOS communities and the descendants and to connect the behavioral to the biological, so that we can understand, just like the Justice Department's report and other publications that talk about the lost wealth of those of people who were the victims of those massacres. It would be interesting to see, while we lost that wealth, did we accrue not only the disadvantage, but did we accrue that on a biological level? To understand, really, like, connecting, how does all of these traumas impact this specific group toward maybe adverse health outcomes? And if you see like, from like fundamental biological concepts like telomeres and other ways, like genetically, that you can see like things genetic changes potentially. I don't know, but maybe we could have a comprehensive study that could really help lay the groundwork. I think that could lay a huge groundwork for advocacy, because you can kind of walk a reader or walk someone from point A to point Z to see how all of these effects, from a psychological perspective, from a historical trauma, impact the health outcomes of these people, of ADOS people and ADOS communities.
So if I'm hearing that right, and let me try to put it in my terms, no letters behind my name terms, and so you're essentially saying, like, if we have, let's say, blood pressure, for instance, if we were talking about
blood pressure, blood draws, cortisol, all kind of stuff. But
so we could be talking about, what are the economic impacts on it? What are the corporate impacts on blood pressure and the type of stress that Black folks experience in the workforce? How that affects? What are the lack of food on blood pressure? What is underemployment's effect on blood pressure? Or what is, not just thinking of one category, but across a bunch of disciplines for the same issue, or the same shared experience, like a massacre or things of that. Am I capturing that correctly?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
I think the key point is just really bringing having an interdisciplinary approach to providing a comprehensive understanding of what the ADOS experiences looks like, because we know what it looks like on the page, but do you know what that experience looks like when you, like, what from your genetics, your blood pressure, like how that all looks like in multiple different disciplines, in a way that I don't think we are able to see right now, because we don't have that disaggregated data.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and people are asking these questions. I haven't sent it yet because I just found it this past week. We're on spring break now, so
Hey.
I'm trying to get a little bit of a reprieve. But being chair is a mantle of its own. But there was actually a paper that came out. I guess it first came out in January of this year, and the title is actually "How Epigenetic Inheritance Fails to Explain the Black-White Health Gap." So I'm curious to dive in there and see what it is that they're looking at and their methodology, because that's another thing that the Institute is interested in doing. We're not the only ones necessarily asking these questions. There might be people who have heard of it or not, heard of the ADOS movement or not, but they just know that, oh, this is an interesting group to study, which is very frequent, right? And we're usually the kind of that group in the findings and things that I see, where people just kind of expect that this is the bottom group, and so we're just going to relate all of the information that we find to the Black category and see how they do relative to them, because they're usually on the bottom. They don't say it that way, but that's pretty much
because
how it
everyone
goes.
knows what has happened to us.
Yes, they
Like
do.
there, I don't think there's enough research out there just from a history perspective where someone could get a full picture of what we've experienced in this country. So they all know.
Yeah, and I am 100% with Dr. Rogers on that vision of some sort of comprehensive multi/interdisciplinary project where we can really capture, and ultimately that's what we're hoping to do. It just would be much more streamlined and maybe happen a little bit faster if we did have that nice magic wand.
That magic wand. I'm working on one. All of my attempts, maybe I didn't put enough chemistry into it. All of my
Yeah,
attempts
that's what it
failed.
is. That's what it is.
So again, for those listening, ADOSRI, ADOSRI.org. You can find out more about the ADOS Research Institute. You know, one of the things that I think a lot of people, we hear a lot now, and we've heard it for a bunch of years, is STEM, 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 STEM. Your kids need to be in STEM. If you're an adult, you need to decide to go ahead and get into STEM, like whatever, like everything has kind of been pushed into STEM. And we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but no one really talks about the hostility in or the anti-blackness or anti-ADOSness, since we're disaggregating in those areas, right? That's something people don't talk about. And what ends up happening a lot of times is that people fall out of those disciplines. It's just, hey, it's too much to bear, right? Like, hey, I'm the only black person here and I'm catching hell left and right, right? Like I see people so as a black PhD, as an ADOS PhD, and with it being such a small subset of PhDs, how have you navigated the challenges of maybe being the only ADOS person in the room, as well as some of the hostility or racism that we deal with in every aspect of life?
You raising my blood pressure right now. I just want to let you know.
See, it's having that effect. We need to study it. We need to study it, brother.
I think for me, one of the biggest things was knowing that it wasn't just me. So, and really looking to the literature, and I think there are researchers. I can think of some like Dr. Brian Burt out of University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Sharon Fries Britt as well, who's focused on, I think, Blacks in physics. Dr. Burt has focused on Black men in engineering. And I think there are many scholars in the field. Those are just two that come to my mind right now. But there are several scholars that have really looked at different parts of this quote unquote pipeline to see what are the impacts of Black men, Black women in STEM disciplines, and what are the challenges. And some choose to look at it from a deficit model, meaning like what are the things that this population lacks, versus like I know from Dr. Burt's research, he looks at it from a strengths perspective, like what causes this demographic to persist, leading to obtaining the PhD or the master's degree, but completing their education. And so one of the other challenges, I think, is that understanding how the hostility looks can be very difficult, because difficult to articulate, because it's not like someone's going to hurl racial epithets at you. It can be subtle, as though like you're seen as invisible. Like, for example, when I was in graduate school, a now professor, Black faculty member in psychology, encouraged me to read this book by Dr. Anderson J. Franklin about the invisibility syndrome. And what the invisibility syndrome is where he coined the term. It's looking at Black men as a population sample and showing, and what he's saying is that invisibility syndrome is, in a nutshell, when your skills are not recognized or valued in like the workplace. And so you look and you seek that acknowledgement in other areas, in a nutshell. And so, and if you can be like, everyone says like, oh, you just feel like an imposter. My question is, well, was it because the person was made invisible and then they don't feel like they've been trained? They may not feel like they have been developed. Like you have, where you can be allowed to be in the room, but are you given the tools to grow, to develop, to be the best, to reach the level that you want to reach? Sometimes we're smart, we're brought in to these opportunities, but not given the tools to necessarily thrive in the opportunities. And so understanding how anti-Blackness looks, what it looks like, anti-ADOSness, like understanding how that, like, simple things as far as like you can feel like you're not understood, like, like, but this is the only country that I've known, but yet I am not understood. How I think is not understood. How I show up is not understood. And how to manage all of those things without suffering mentally and physically and emotionally is, I would say, can be real challenges.
I hear, like, when I hear you speak of that, I can't tell if it's academia or corporate America. Like it's some of the same things, a lot of the same things in that invisibility. What was the name of the book that you just mentioned again?
The invisibility syndrome. It's his name is the professor's name is Dr. Anderson J. Franklin. You can find it on Amazon. But yeah, it's a powerful book.
With that in mind, Dr. Speller, I'd like to ask you, like, if you could go back and give some advice to your younger self while you were on this academic journey, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh man. It might be different advice at different stages.
Mm.
I did my undergrad at an HBCU, Winston-Salem State University. Go Rams.
Shout out HBCUs.
And yes, sir. Yes, sir. We all HBCU alum in here.
That's right. That's right.
Now.
All three.
Yeah.
Go the real HU, aka Hampton. I'm hating.
Yeah. So when I was there, I actually started off as a music major. I was a vocal major, piano minor. And then I switched because I was on an academic scholarship, and I calculated it and figured it would take me a bit too long because I would have had to get a business degree as well as the music degree. So it would have been there an extra year, and I was like, I'm not paying for it. I had already any mowed it and landed on the college acceptance letter instead of calling the military recruiter back, because I was definitely headed to the U.S. Army. But that's a different story. So in this journey, as I'm figuring out what I want to do, I end up going down the psychology route. I thought I was going to do music therapy, but then I ended up going to the experimental route and getting into the Ohio State. There were I applied to 4 schools, I had 2 rejections, 2 acceptances. And so in that undergraduate phase, I would probably have told myself to slow down a little bit. One of the things, and to like pace myself a little bit more, and it'll be okay. Part of that is because, you may lose people along the way in the journey, and you're so focused, especially because I was a traditional age student at the time. I was in my, 18 to 22 range doing undergrad. And, I was really focused on how it is that I can like contribute back to the family. And there was definitely some, what we refer to as John Henryism. We have to get Dr. Hill again, mentioning him again, I have to get him on here to talk about more of that. But basically from the folktale about John Henry, who was working a railroad and was facing job insecurity, right, because of new technology, the train, the steam engine, or whatever device it was that was going to lay those tracks faster. So he did all that he had to do in order to secure his position. Spoiler alert for a folktale, but ultimately culminating in his his passing. But that was I ended up having a panic attack in my senior year because of all the things that I was doing. I was doing research. I was, as an undergraduate, my advisor had me teaching some of the lectures to some of my peers, which was kind of crazy, but it was a good experience. And then we were going out and presenting things. I was applying to graduate school. I was doing too much. And one of the things I would have told myself is, it's okay. Like, you'll be all right. Getting into graduate school and then experiencing with what Dr. Rogers was just talking about. Now I'm here. There are far fewer of folks who look like me, but I do want to say shout out to the HBCUs helping me figure out where it is who I am in the world in a way. And I know we all probably had the experience of taking the Pan-African class, whatever they called it, at our respective institutions. And I got a B in that, by the way. And I'm gonna tell you why. I think it was because that professor did not like that I was challenging some of those ideas. So even at 19 or however I was like, let's talk about this a little more. I digress. But in that formation of the self, right, I had the grit and determination to know that they let me in here, I can do it. It's my time to shine. There was a lot of social comparison that was happening. And I would have told myself, focus on you. You got a family. These changes have happened in your life. Worry about you. Just do what you got to do in order to get it done. But also take it easy a little bit here, right? Don't carve these years off your life stressing out so much. Another insidious way that, the anti-Blackness of academia or the academy can show up is in ways that you, like Dr. Rogers was saying, would not necessarily recognize. There was one point in my career where I was in at least 3 different labs. I had 2 different advisors, and I was pulling together an experience that they didn't offer through a specific program because they didn't offer human factors ergonomics at Ohio State. But I was able to pull together, I was in an engineering lab, I was in a cognitive psych lab, and I was in an emotions quantitative psychophysiology clinical lab. And so I was like combining all these experiences, again, doing too much. But I knew that I had an idea, and what I was able to figure out, and one thing that I was glad about is that I didn't necessarily have a 40-year question, career driving question that I wanted to solve, like my primary advisor at the time had. He had this one thing that he'd been working on for 50 years or however long he's been doing it. I just wanted the tools to solve problems. And the path that I took has enabled me to acquire skills and abilities, but also figure out how to think. And then if I need to acquire more skills, stretch myself to see how far I can get those. But there was a few points in that journey where I ended up in what I call research purgatory, where I was pulled from projects because they wanted me to focus on this one thing. There was about a year in my graduate experience, a whole year, which is crazy. Especially with what tuition costs and all the things that I was having to do in order to stay in graduate school, where I just met with that initial advisor every Wednesday at 1 p.m. See how it affected me? This was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, however long it was. Every Wednesday at 1 p.m., I show up in his office and he would just stare and he would just make these snide comments and he would say these statements where the tone was hinting at derogatory and was hinting at a particular kind of perspective that he may have had on me, and what did not register for me for that entire year, because I had failed my initial general exam, which most people do. Most people go into their, you start off as a PhD student, and then you take your general exam qualifications, at least in my discipline. You take your general exams or your quals or whatever, and then you move into becoming a PhD candidate. So initially, a lot of people fail the first time, and then they come back and they do better on the second time. That's not uncommon in my area. And so after failing that first time, he required that I show up every Wednesday at 1, and we went through this. And it never dawned on me in that entire year that he was waiting for me to quit. it didn't dawn on me that he was just like trying to hold this out and that he was going to interact with me in particular ways where I should have been like, oh, okay, well, then maybe this isn't for me. And, been one of the many people that maybe I had some similarities to in academia who experienced attrition. They got the master's and they left. Or they realized, you know what, this ain't for me and I'm going to go into the industry or to the workforce or whatever. But again, me driving forward to just kind of like make it there and get there and to show him that I can do this kind of thing was what was driving. So at that point, I probably would have told myself, realize what's happening and drop this dude way earlier. Do some self-advocacy. Go to the policies. Go find people in the department that you can talk to because you do feel isolated because it ain't that much of y'all. And I used to feel some type of way because somehow all the Black people kind of ended up in one lab, or at least adjacent in one lab.
The black lab.
It was literally the black lab, right? But in a way, it was a little bit of an oasis because it was also other like racial minority groups who were in there. And it's not to say that they didn't also contribute to other labs, but it was literally like we were all in this kind of space and kind of knew each other. And then, of course, we had other things like the Hale Center, which they better leave alone because, they doing some, making some bad choices at Ohio State, in my opinion, with all these directives. I'm sure you probably heard in the news about the funding threatening that's happening and, shut down all your DEI stuff. And so the Hale Center is just one place that's like the Mecca for us to go to. And they have great programming. But I probably would have told myself, let me wrap it up here, that, go ahead and alleviate some of this year-long stress that you're going to experience. Switch advisors. People do it in graduate school. It's okay. And then just focus on whatever the next project is. Meet those deliverables. And, once again, find something that you can enjoy and do that much earlier than what happened for me. There was at one point where I was just like, you know what? I'm doing all I can do. My dissertation changed like 2 or 3 different times, completely different projects, right? It like this it happens. But I probably would have told me to go find somebody who can coach me and find people who've had experiences because I was really just putting it all on my back and just push it forward.
It's what it sounds like is the need for self-empowerment in hostile environments to seek safety and to seek a different experience within the whole construct that you're working. And I'd argue that that same advice could be given to someone in a corporate situation where if you're not getting the development that you want in your current situation, there may be a manager next door in a different department that's willing to give it to you. So go empower yourself to seek the thing that you need. But I think that that's hard to come to when everything you see is weaponized against you. So I think even us sharing these stories, I think about young folks who are trying to go get their master's, trying to get their PhD. And I'm betting the majority of stuff they hear is like, yeah, you should do it. Let's go. You're smart. You can all this. But no one tells them that they're showing up behind enemy lines when they get there. So I really, really appreciate that perspective.
Can I add one more thing to that before?
Sure.
I just want to, and I know I've been yapping, so I try to keep this part brief. But I think that also contributes to why it is that there seems to be such a vacancy of Black academics, ADOS academics, who are focused on doing the work specifically for ADOS people, like the Research Institute is effectively designed to do. Your course of study, one of the things that you also consider in your graduate self, I don't want to be, at least in the social behavioral sciences, and Dr. Rogers can maybe tell me in maybe the physical life sciences, I don't want to be the Black studies guy. I don't want to be the one that always has to have the tint or the tinge of I'm studying Black people and so on and so forth. You might not vocalize that. It might be one of those feelings that are kind of latent in there, but that's what can occur, especially because you are one of the few. I was looking at some of the stats before we came on here about in my year who graduated and what those particular statistics were in terms of, it was from one of the things that I found from the national, some sort of educational database. It was like 708 PhDs in psychology for Black. And so that's not necessarily disaggregated, but we're talking out of nearly 200,000 people, right? So, and the field of psychology is already broad. And then to what Dr. Rogers was kind of getting at us earlier, like when it comes to Black men, that's going to be even lower because the percentages are kind of skewed in favor of women going to universities. And now they're acquiring more of the percentage of doctoral degrees in some of these specific areas. So I do try to defend my Black PhD allies in the academy somewhat, because I get it, right? The specialty may not actually be related to something that's necessarily quote unquote Black. We got a ton of people doing Africana studies. I think we capped out on that, right? But I think there is space for you to be able to use your talents in something like the Research Institute to be able to contribute your skills, like what Dr. Rogers was discussing before.
Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No. And I was just.
I'm gonna interject a hot take that when I think of Africana studies, I think of a statement that my grandmother used to make. This person's so heavenly that they're no earthly good. And it's interesting that you have all of these academics focused on history while ignoring what's happening to us in real time and how history plays a part in that and how to move the people forward. Because I found the academic view on us wanting to disaggregate by so many has been taken negatively. Right? Like it's been taken negatively. We're like, I can't believe you want to find out what's happening directly to ADOS in this scenario. It's happening to all Black people. Well, data disagrees with that. So, Dr. Rogers, if there's an academic out here listening right now who's like, hey, I want to contribute, I want to study what you all are talking about, or here goes my discipline, how can they get in touch with you and what should they do?
I think the first thing that they can do is to definitely check out the website, adosri.org. Also, reach out to us directly via email at contact@adosri.org or director@adosri.org to have the conversation and let's talk about what your interests are and let's see where they can align. I think we are interested in We are definitely interested in collaborating with several centers. We have kind of a list of scholars and academics that we want to reach out to. So I would definitely just say, it starts with a simple hello email, and let's start having the conversation about what your work is and how you would like to contribute in a collaborative sense.
I just want to read this one section off of you all's page, specifically for other academics who want to get involved, and that's in your goals section or the Our Goals section. The central goals: centering ADOS people in interdisciplinary research and publications, providing a bedrock of research and supporting efforts towards characterizing the disenfranchisement of ADOS people through current day, creating a collaborative network of scholars and institutions in the ongoing study of ADOS people, and generating independent research ideas that support the mission and initiatives of the ADOS Research Institute. So if you're an academic out there and you want to make a difference and you want to contribute to the needed research of ADOS people, please make sure you're going to adosri.org. That's adosri.org. It has been such a pleasure having both of you on with the ADOS Research Institute. I'd like to give you just a quick second here to hit us with your final spiel or thoughts around these topics today. So I'll start with you, Dr. Speller, and we'll close out with you, Dr. Rogers.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. Always good to connect. I'm honored to be a part of the ADOS Research Institute, and it's so far starting off, I think, in a way that's going to be really impactful. And the last thing that I just want to emphasize is just be mindful of the information that you are engaging with. Sometimes it may be better to take a step back, definitely evaluate the information. I'm teaching my students this as well, in particular in an age of generative artificial intelligence, which will often hallucinate and create things. People are also, I mentioned the term satisficing earlier, which is basically you just kind of decide this is good enough. Some of these summaries might not be good enough. So being data driven, data oriented, I just really encourage people, pay attention to the sources that you're dealing with. You can utilize great information to do what it is that you need to do, whether it's create new research or in your consumption of information that's out there, and get involved at whatever level, if it's the institute or whatever it is that you need to be involved with in order to help make and affect change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Speller. Dr. Rogers.
Well, first, I definitely want to say thank you for this opportunity to be on to speak with the audience and speak with you about the work of the ADOS Research Institute. Also, I would like to mention that I think that it is really important for us to recognize that not only, like from my experience with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation and now the ADOS Research Institute, it wasn't just me contributing my skills. What I got out a lot more, I feel like I got out a lot more than what I got in. I felt like then what I put in a lot, but I feel like by leaps and bounds, I benefited from this experience because for me, I felt like from the topics that we've talked about, the ADOS Advocacy Foundation doing the work and seeing the results and seeing the fruits of the labor was restorative in a way that I don't know if we all recognize when we talk about these experiences, talk about the data, being able to plug in our skills with the ADOS Foundation and see the fruits that come out of it can definitely restore us in a way that sometimes make us visible, allow those skills to have a positive outlet so that we can show our creativity and even expand what we thought was possible for us as volunteers. So I just wanted to say thank you. And I am just very grateful that my path intersected with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation and now the ADOS Research Institute.
Dr. Rogers, Dr. Speller, thank you so much for being on the Critical Mass podcast today. Again, you can go to adosri.org, adosri.org, to learn more about the ADOS Research Institute. Both of our guests today spoke a little bit about volunteerism. Both of them, before starting the ADOS Research Institute, volunteered with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation. Today's episode is sponsored by the ADOS Advocacy Foundation. So I'd also love to tell you all about a campaign that the ADOS Advocacy Foundation has going right now. That is our Justice for Generations campaign. You can go to adosfoundation.org, and at the very top, you can donate, as the ADOS Advocacy Foundation is accepting donations for an effort to create a comprehensive ADOS reparations bill. We feel that what has been out there previously is not sufficient. So adosfoundation.org, you can get involved. If you aren't a PhD or you're not a researcher and you want to volunteer in your local area and make an impact on your community, the ADOS Advocacy Foundation is where we want you. And if you're a researcher and in academia or in industry making a difference, please come in and work with the ADOS Research Institute. Again, we have chapters across the country with the ADOS Advocacy Foundation, launching more every day. And we look forward to working collectively with all of you to make an impact on our community. I am Simeon with the Critical Mass Podcast. Thank you so much for joining, and you all have a great afternoon.